On Game Talk Live, we look at the world of esports in South Korea. From cultural acceptance to high-speed internet, what makes this country a hotbed of esports talent? Let's get to it. I'm Mandy Roman, and welcome to Game Talk Live, where we discuss the biggest video game news of the day, live with help from our chat audience. Joining me now are three expert guests to discuss these gaming topics and more. First up is Thomas. Thomas, also known as Khaldor, has been an esport commentator for 16 years, starting his career with Warcraft 3. He lived in Korea for 3 years to commentate StarCraft 2 and is currently commentating Blizzard's official broadcast for Heroes of the Storm. Welcome, Khaldor.
Hey, how are you doing?
Good, thank you. Also joining us today is Josh Kim, the LCS team manager for FlyQuest League of Legends team. He is also the former team manager of Immortals LA Valiant, and Josh loves any game with a good story. Welcome to the show, Josh. And also joining us today is Nick DeRazio, a longtime esports fanatic who now works as esports manager and journalist for InvenGlobal. He specializes in emerging esports, classic video games, and competitive video game strategy. Welcome back to the show, Nick.
Hello. It's always good to be here.
Great to have you. All right, guys, let's hop right to it. South Korea is undoubtedly a global leader in esports, as illustrated by their consistent, dominating performances throughout history. While a majority of the world is just getting acquainted to the scene, esports have been a huge influence in South Korea for years. Thanks to a society that intrinsically supports talented players, the country continues to outshine and outplay the competition at every turn. Would you say South Korea as a country is the most accepting of professional gaming as a viable career option? Khaldor, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, I actually think that's pretty fair to say. It's like I've been traveling through Europe, Korea, and also a lot through North America, obviously. And it's really one of the key aspects that if you're in Korea and you talk about esports, you talk about some of the most popular games, everybody knows what you're talking about. Whereas in Europe, you always just get a couple of glares where people are looking at you and like, you're doing what? Professional commentating or playing? So you play video games all day. So you don't really have that in Korea. So from a cultural perspective, it's definitely a lot more accepted. And that, of course, helps players also get into the scene and just grow as players.
Mm-hmm. Josh, maybe you can talk about this a little bit. What kind of infrastructure is in place to maybe foster new talent in South Korea?
I always make comparisons to sports and soccer, and you have your countries that are very good at soccer. I think it just comes from just naturally, physically, how dense the cities are, the metropolitans are. Seoul, Busan, your major cities, and everybody, when they don't go to school, they go to PC cafes afterwards, and your youth is just surrounded by a community of like-minded people that helps cultivate competition at an earlier age that gives them that advantage going on into the future, and perhaps really wanting to become a pro player, cultivating that dream as well.
Mm-hmm. Nick, what are your initial thoughts? Would you say South Korea is the most accepting of esports as a career?
Yeah. I kind of like to think of it a little more romantically, I guess. I think that there's a lot of people in Korea that are born with the idea of being an esports pro. And I think that that idea is something that can live with them forever. It can live with them when they're just starting out. It can live with them when they're just a teenager. And I think that idea allows them to make the necessary sacrifice and to make the necessary grind to really be the best. I think that that idea, when placed in someone maybe in the US, is often killed with a lot of hard facts, dead facts that are about, oh, well, you can't make it and it's not going to be enough money, or why don't you go to school? Obviously, Koreans have that problem too, but I think for them it's easier to keep the dream alive because, as Khaldor said, everyone knows about esports there. It's not something you have to explain. It's a dream that you actually can do and you can make.
Mm-hmm.
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 So how does this productive environment help set up potential pros for success? Khaldor?
It's actually a really good point, because I feel when we're looking at Korea and why there are so many pro gamers in Korea, we're looking at a couple of variables. And of course, the cultural aspect is really important. But I would say that more important even is the infrastructure that Korea has. And I want to come back to a point that Joshua actually made earlier. He talked a lot about the density, and especially with Seoul, you have that. So when we're talking about esports, one of the key aspects that the Koreans always, where they had a bit of a leg up, was that from an infrastructure point of view, they had an advantage. And that's not only internet speeds, but that also comes back to team houses, for example. If you don't insist on having a team house in the middle of Seoul, like downtown, then rent is actually extremely cheap as long as you move outside a little bit. So all of a sudden it becomes extremely easy for you to set a team house up because the costs that you have are very low if you compare it to what you would have to pay in North America or in Europe. And at the same time, you have also, thanks to the density, most of the players already living in Seoul or close by. So setting up a team house and having several teams or players that can practice against each other, that can live together and really have this entire practice environment, it's something that's very difficult to accomplish for an American team, for example, where you have half your players on the East Coast, you have the other half on the West Coast or in the middle, and in Europe, you have them scattered around several countries. So for them to move together into a team house and get that practice environment and that advantage is incredibly difficult, whereas in Korea, that comes very natural once that you make the decision that you want to go into esports.
Joshua, do you agree? Do you want to elaborate at all?
I definitely agree. I feel like he touched up on a very strong point. It's more of it's a breeding ground since you have you have competition within the culture as well. The country itself is physically tiny. It's very accessible as an organization and as a player. I also want to touch up on a point that Nick brought up, is that you have that dream from when you're young. However, I won't say that it's easier to accomplish. You have more competition around you, but jobs, economically speaking, Korea does not provide that many good jobs for young adults. But esports, you get that fame, you get that limelight in front of the camera, and it's something that's tangible that kids can see and think, I can be the best at something and make a lot of money and succeed that way. And that dream is very important, and along with the infrastructure, with the proximity as well.
John in chat says, South Korea made esports a big deal back with the original StarCraft, so it feels like the country has had a years-long head start. We'll be where they are now in 2025 at this rate. I don't know if it's that far off, but speaking on StarCraft, is the vibe and production values for South Korean esports events also different? Khaldor, what's been your experience casting in South Korea, say, versus other countries?
This is actually an interesting topic because I feel as good as Korea is in setting everything up and as much of an advantage that they had, I think one of the problems that we have when we come to production side is that a lot of the productions have been very stagnant in Korea. The production value when I first moved there was actually very interesting because we had for the first time, or I personally had for the first time, a big studio set up, and that was pretty impressive. But at the same time, if you look how especially the event organization have developed since then, where you have in Europe leading companies like ESL or DreamHack and others that set up just top-notch event, and you have a similar structure also in the US by now, and you compare that to what happens in Korea, it always feels that Korea didn't quite develop as fast as the West did. Of course, the Western scene had to do a lot of catching up, but I feel they've done it by now. And comparing events, I would actually say that if you take the current stand, then the West has even eclipsed Korea to an extent when it comes to production value and the organization of big-time events. So it's a weird, interesting limbo where Korea, when it comes to the players, still have an insane advantage. And a lot of Korean players are still the ones that everybody looks towards when we're talking about the best in the business. But on the production side, while Koreans are extremely good, I feel their advantage is more so in the everyday league play than in setting up big-time events where they can also do an exceptional job, but where I feel the West has more than caught up.
Go ahead,
and if possible, I actually just want to, I think that the reason a lot of Korean events still kind of in our minds are always like these big events, because for the longest time, they were always winning on attendance. Like there were always so many people that wanted to watch these events. So during kind of the early days when everyone else is just for the first time seeing these visuals, we would see these huge stadium seating. But I think kind of to jump on the point that Khaldor made, my own take on it would be that these Western companies like ESL and like the DreamHacks, they've been making these tournaments with an international, much bigger esports industry in mind. So I think that's why that they've upped the game and why the overall quality of these events is higher. I'd still say that Korea probably has better attendance, or at least more consistent attendance. So yeah, I'd say that is one of the biggest differentiators from my experience attending these events.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead,
I want
Joshua.
to add something on top of that as well. Both Thomas and Nick are talking about large events and attendance, and how other regions have stepped up their game in terms of these events. But I also want to say that Korea's production value's strength lies a lot in their storytelling and getting in to know players and teams a little bit more, and weaving a story outside of the game itself for the viewers to connect with the talent. And I feel like that's something that is, I think, crucial for the audience and viewers, and definitely something that other regions can step up in as well.
Mm-hmm. So do players and casters and talent, would you say, have celebrity status in South Korea?
Definitely.
Yeah,
definitely. I mean, I'm sure you guys know as well, but if these teams and players, they show up in airports just like celebrities that you see on the silver screen, they've got fan followings that go and take pictures and stuff. It's crazy.
Khaldor, did
And
you get
talking about-
recognized?
Well, for us it was a bit different because we, of course, didn't do the Korean broadcast, but outside of the studio and everything, yeah, definitely. So you got recognized quite a bit more. But I would even argue that I get more recognized in the West. It's, of course, a difference if you're at an event or if you're just living everyday life. But I want to also make another point when we're talking about production value within Korea. I think one of the important things to highlight is that Koreans really are very good at doing the studio broadcast. And I touched upon that a bit earlier, but I want to go a little bit deeper here. One of the advantages that you have with any kind of Korean league, no matter what game you're talking about, no matter how small, is that because you have the density of players around Seoul, players always play in an offline environment. So even for the smaller games, you will have the players at the studio. And that already gives you all of a sudden a tool that production can use to step up the entire game. So you have player shots, you have the players on site, you can interview them before and after the game, and that is insanely important. One also going to come back to what Nick talked earlier when he said about the consistent on-site viewer numbers. That's a really important part. It also comes back to the density of Seoul, because you have a local studio in which you can produce, let's say, 5 different games. You just have to change what you throw on the wall, and you have to change the logos of the game, but that's about it. But the audience knows that no matter when they come, there will be an esports event that you broadcast, there will be a game going. So you can make that a regular thing for yourself and your friends to attend that. And then, of course, it's then reflected in the attendance number. The audience is always there. That's amazing for the players. You have the players on site. But for the production, it's also a fantastic tool that they can use to now just make the broadcast so much more enticing for the audience. So I think we have to distinguish between league production on every day and the big event production when you have a grand final happening, on the other hand.
Sure. So let's talk about PC cafes for a moment here. PC cafes are a culture all their own in South Korea, unlike here in the West, where most gaming is done in our own homes. Does the social nature of gaming cafes contribute to team building or conditioning for these pros? Nick, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, I feel like I could talk about this topic alone all day.
Yeah.
I think
Same
that
here,
the
same
social
here.
aspect. The social aspect of being the best is so vital. If you have a teammate, or if you have an ally, or if you even have a rival, and you're in the same place and you're playing this person, not only can you talk about strategies, but you can live that game every day. And that's just so vital. Not only does it give you automatic land experience, but you also have experience being right next to your opponent. There's a lot of stress. There's a lot of tension. There's a lot of nerves that come when you're playing at the highest level. And I think that that's one thing that Korean programmers have always had in spades. They have this LAN experience, and they have this concept of living around the game and this lifestyle of competitive gaming that makes them very much more immune to stress and more immune to a burnout to other Western players who are now trying to compete in this Korean level of esports excellence. It's very hard to go from an online warrior, as they call them, to all of a sudden now having to compete with these Korean players and compete on their level. So yes, I think that's huge, and that's a really big advantage they've always had.
I do agree. I wouldn't say that they're immune. I'd say they're conditioned. A lot of the social aspects, you go, you play with friends, you play online, and you get onto that rank list. You're number one in your country, and you're very proud because your country, South Korea, is the best in esports. And all of a sudden, you have this pride behind you. That's definitely needed when you're playing with friends. You're able to make fun of each other. You're there in the same PC cafe, and you're pointing each other out. And I think that helps build teamwork at an early stage, because we all know that good teams are able to be honest with each other. And that infrastructure, that society and community of PC Bangs is able to help enable that kind of mindset.
So Khaldor, why don't you think this trend took off in the West in terms of just PC gaming cafes, and that gaming really happens at home?
I think there's a couple of aspects to it. First of all, I think most of us had PCs their own PCs at some point, but I feel one of the biggest problems was just, again, that you didn't have the density of population that you have, and the exceptions culturally that you have in Korea. So in the West, I don't think it was that appealing. The entire way that from a technical aspect as well, like bandwidth, for example, the entire way this industry has grown in the West was very, very different from Korea, where we had, for example, the government even taking steps to promote everything. Bandwidth was also a huge target of the Korean government at some point, just to make sure that they are on a completely different technical level, not only for gaming, but just in general. And all of these things help to build that culture. Also, for a lot of kids, at least what I've been told when I was in Korea, gaming cafes were also a bit of an escape, because when you, for example, didn't have school, you didn't want to go home because your parents were there. And if you wanted to skip out on anything, that was just a safe haven to go. You could play with your friends, you could have a lot of fun. So these entire aspects together just promoted the entire culture. Whereas in the West, esports has grown very differently. For us, it has grown later and with a very different growth pattern that was also, of course, a little bit slowed down, just simply because internet cafes weren't as attractive. Most people were completely spread out. You have like small villages in Europe. Not every town can have an internet cafe, for example. In the US, you have, of course, big cities, but at the same time, who wants to travel for like an eternity until you are finally able to play with friends? In Korea, you hop on the subway and 15 minutes later, you are whenever you want to be.
I mean, I remember when I was younger. Go ahead. You go ahead, Nick.
Well, I was just going to say real quick, Khaldor said the word appeal, and I just want to also jump on that. I was once interviewing a Korean player, and I asked him a similar question, and he very frankly said, well, if you were good at video games, you were cool, like this was something that if you were really good at these games, you were someone that people wanted to be friends with, you wanted to, hang out with. And I can say with 100% real life experience, you were not cool when you were good at video games in my school or in my neighborhood.
What are you talking about?
So yeah, there was no appeal to after school spending 6 hours playing video games for any U.S. kid. I'm sure there was somewhere someone in chat could be like, oh, well, for me, no. But in my experience and many others, yeah, there was not that Korean appeal to go there and socialize and be great.
And talking about appeal for PC Bangs, I mean, it was $1 an hour when I was a kid going to PC Bangs in Korea. I came back to America and I was like, why don't we have these in America? And then you find one finally, it's like $5 an hour, and you're like, I wouldn't go there at all. It's just about accessibility. And even to this day, PC Bangs are like $1 an hour in Korea. I don't know how much it is in America anymore.
I don't even know if many exist. I feel like people just go like the library if they need internet, like outside of like their mobile phones or their homes. So Josh, maybe you can answer this question. Are more traditional sports like baseball or soccer not played by kids? Is it just kind of study and like play video games? I feel like, a lot of, Brazilians are great at soccer and Americans do football, or American football, I should say. And then, esports is just synonymous with South Korea.
I think everyone has some kids do have the dream to become baseball players and football players, and surprisingly American football players as well. I just think it's hard to get that acclaim. I think esports as a dream has become bigger because it's getting so much more internationally recognized, not just as players, but as the country itself, as South Korea. Baseball, we do have a very good national baseball team, but you don't really hear many stories of these kids that have this dream to become baseball players because it's just not easily seen. But esports here, I mean, you're watching right now. Everyone around the world is watching Korean leagues and so on and so forth. So I can't say that there's any less players that want to be baseball players. It's just not seen very often.
Sure. So do you think the internet, accessibility to the internet has anything to do with it? I mean, South Korea has the fastest internet in the world. So, Khaldor, what do you think?
I definitely think it plays a huge role. When I moved over, they just announced, I think the first internet connection that I had was back then at 100 up, 100 down, which was for me absolutely insane. And then you heard about plans of the government who said oh, it's too slow, we need to make it 10 times faster. And I was just looking at them, I was just the hell are you talking about? I already don't know what to do with that. What would I do with the internet even faster? So it was crazy, and in a positive sense. So also for streaming, there was a big part. But so it definitely helped. That was a huge thing, but it only goes, of course, to a certain extent. After a certain up and download limit, you don't get any improvements for gaming necessarily. Then your internet is definitely fast enough. When you talk about streaming, then it's a bit of a different story. But that's a very good example where Korea, for example, completely missed the hype train and the bandwagon. They took on streaming very, very late. And that's also true for the teams that try to promote esports through it, because they just didn't realize what kind of a big deal it would be in the future.
Sure. Nick, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I would love to talk more about internet speed. So I currently work for a Korean company, and all of my colleagues are Korean, and we're here in the US now. They complain about the internet speeds all the time. It's a big deal. It's a difference. And I'd also say, in terms of the topic of did it help the emerging esport landscape, even to look at StarCraft or even Warcraft 3 for examples, there is just things you can do when you don't need to worry about super high ping. There's just certain strategies, there's certain techniques, there's certain things you can learn to do when you know that your internet speeds and your connection aren't going to be impeded. Maybe this is a marine, a micro, maybe this is various other tricks that you can do that have to deal with very, very precise gameplay. So I think, again, all of that leads to what I was kind of saying before about the LAN environments and how you can really up your game. I think that when trying to compete with Koreans, some of these micro and mechanical skills that are only possible in the best internet environments was something that Koreans were just ahead of us on. They were just ahead of other regions because they've never really had to worry about 100 ping when you're trying to play a game like StarCraft.
Let me just touch up on that real quickly, because there's a couple of good points there. One of the things that was very impressive when we're talking about the top Koreans is that, at least in the times of StarCraft 2, they did not only play on their own server. So we had a lot of Koreans that would play all the Korean leagues, they would play in the Korean tournaments, but then at the same time, they would look at the online competition. And most of the online competition was, because of marketing reasons, centered in Europe, on the European server, or in North America. And we had a lot of Koreans that just jumped time zones and all of a sudden started to compete in European tournaments and in North American tournaments from Korea, where they had a significant disadvantage through ping and still dominated those. And that was a huge chunk of the money that they actually made for themselves. I mean, we had Hyun, for example, a famous StarCraft 2 player back then, winning a North American tournament 11 or 12 times in a row, which was at that point just absolutely ridiculous. So it was all about the competition that you faced, but also the willingness to play in the middle of the night, for example, even with ping disadvantages, which made a lot of the top Koreans just great.
Matthew in chat
Wow.
says better ASP, better APM. So have to agree. Josh, do you want to elaborate?
Yeah, I mean, it's very short. It's basically if you want to get good at a sport, you need to have the ball to play it. Same thing. I mean, Korea, you just have the tools that enabled you to be really good. So basically, that's what it is. I think it was very crucial that high internet speeds definitely helped instigate that growth for these players.
Sure. Josh, would you say Korean players play differently than players from other countries or regions?
Yes and no. Yes and no because I think everybody who's not Korean can play like a Korean. And now what does a Korean have? I think it's just pride. It really is just pride about being the best and I can be the best and having that cockiness behind you, that arrogance to say that, you know, I hit rank 1 in Korea because of our infrastructure and so on and so forth.
Nick, you have something to add?
Yeah, that's such a fantastic question. There's so many ways you could try to answer it. I think one of the biggest things that define a Korean player is, just like Josh said, that confidence. But I also think that you cannot ignore the fact that it's easy to get shook. It's easy to get nervous when you know you're playing against the best Korean teams in the world. It's easy to get shook because, you know, you're also this esports fan and you're also like aware of this legacy. So I think a lot of what it comes down to is confidence. And you can talk about, I'm interviewing any single esports player. That's such a huge part of it going in. I think that there is a lot of confidence and pride that goes into, because yeah, you know, this is your country's national sport, so to speak. You know, this is what you are playing among the best of the best. You're not this fish out of water that's trying to compete in the big leagues. You are the big leagues. So I think that if I would have to say, and it's a very general point, how Koreans play, I would agree with Josh. They're confident and they're cocky because they know that they have been playing at the forefront.
Also, I feel.
Go ahead.
Thank you. There's also like discipline that needs to be added into this, I think, because especially when you look at team houses, as we talked before, there were a lot of Western teams that looked at the Korean model and they said, if we can just copy team houses and put the players together, the practice that we'll get and them living the game, talking about it every day and maybe developing new strategies is automatically going to boost any Western team as well, maybe even to an extent that they can compete with Korea. And the experiments at the start that tried to do that failed miserably. And one of the problems was that there was simply structure missing. So there was no coach or no authority figure in a lot of these team houses that would really say, okay, this is our training schedule. This is what you need to adhere to at 10 o'clock p.m. The lights are out, or this is when you have to wake up, something along those lines. Whereas if you looked at any Korean team house, they had a very rigid atmosphere in how they were to play. There were like several blocks of scrims that you had every day. You had free time that you could use for either playing more or for yourself, whatever you needed. And there were certain times when players had to wake up. And the discipline behind that really helped a lot of these players. So it wasn't just like the drive they had to become number one, but it was also the willingness to accept this is a job. This is not just simply me playing a little bit. I have to be disciplined about it. And it took the West a long, long time to really accept that. So you can't just throw a couple of players into your team house and say like, okay, that's everything you need. Let's go ahead and like beat the Koreans. You need to make sure that you have outside of that also the infrastructure and the discipline within the players in the house to emulate the drive and the discipline that is shown on the Korean level.
Josh, what did you want to add?
No, it was just a small quip. What Nick was talking about, it just reminded me of this movie, Catch Me If You Can, where Frank Abagnale Sr. talks about why the Yankees win. It's not because of their players, it's because of the pinstripes. And once they walk onto the field, then you see those pinstripes and you're like, oh. And that's when they win the game. It's similar with Korean players and their confidence. But I do want to agree with the discipline aspect. Even within Korean teams in Korea, the teams that don't have structure and a good coaching staff and are able to whip these players into shape, they're not going to perform well either. But definitely good teams outside of Korea as well will be able to learn from that and apply it to their teams.
Sure. So I had a discussion with another esports fan. Nick, it might have been you. I can't recall who exactly it was, but the actual communication between players in Korean is actually shorter and more efficient than players who communicate in English. Is there any truth to this, or do you believe this has an effect on successful play? Josh, why don't you start us off?
I do.
That wasn't
very
me, by the
strong.
way.
It wasn't you? Okay.
No, it wasn't me. I don't know. That sounds interesting.
All right.
I think I might have said it somewhere, but I definitely have said it before. But I'm a very large advocate for Korean language. I think it's very efficient. There are many reasons to it because it's a mix of Chinese and our own language as well. We speak with a lot of meaning in less syllables. So I think Koreans do have an advantage in that aspect.
Josh, it was probably you then. I feel like that maybe we had this conversation
It
before.
probably is. I probably is.
Yeah.
You know, that's a really fascinating point. Currently, my main esports beat is the Overwatch League. I interview the players and the teams all the time, and one of the things that they always say without fail is it's our communication. Our team comms are either way too messy, way too loud, and that's why we lost. They almost never talk about aim or like mechanics. It's always, we were just talking too loud. We didn't really have much information. So I think that's actually really, really interesting to think because currently the best teams in the Overwatch League are all Korean. And if we're talking about Overwatch played at the highest level, being a game all about communication, I think it would be very, very helpful if you're able to communicate as much information as possible with as little syllables. So I'm going to have to do some more thinking about that, or at least some more research, because it sounds like a fascinating possible explanation for why they're winning so hard.
I would throw a caveat in there, though, because while I agree that language can definitely be an advantage, I mean, the traditional question is always, is a team consisting of 5 players that speak the same language an advantage over a mixed team that has to speak English? That's one way that the discussion often goes. But when it comes to Korea specifically as a language, I think one of the aspects about Korean communication is also social, because the structure has a very strong hierarchy. And that's what you normally have in a full Korean team. So the oldest, for example, has the most respect. And if you're the youngest in the team, then you usually have the least say. There's a couple of things that play into that too. But from a traditional role, this is how a lot of the communication goes as well. So I think it makes structure within a team often more easy and more acceptable within a Korean team, whereas within an international team, you will probably have more figures that step up, want to be the shot caller, the guy who has the impact there. So I could see that playing a role too. So I'm not saying that it's not language, that it's not just Korean being more precise and to the point in how they talk, but I think that social aspect also plays a role in terms of how team communication in general work.
Sure.
That's really interesting.
I definitely agree. I think it also touches up on mutual respect. You talked about age and hierarchy a little bit, but if you have that idea going into a team environment, then you're already cautious of how to talk, how to speak, and present your information without trying to step on each other's toes. I think I've worked within LA Valiant and Immortals before, and we talked about language. We had French players as well, and they were like, speaking English is more comfortable. But aside from that, respecting each other as pros goes beyond language too. But, I think that's the social aspect that Khaldor Thomas was talking about within a team.
Mm-hmm. So are the many professional Korean esports pros just a result of a larger pool of talent? There just happens to be more Korean aspiring esports professionals. Khaldor, what do you think?
I think there's definitely some truth to it because of how it is socially and culturally more accepted. I think there's more players or more people like pushing into this. I feel you see a similar situation with probably Sweden to an extent, where you have a very small population. But if you look at esports, a lot of the players that are at the top are Swedish. So I would say that's a little bit similar when we are trying to transfer the same principle over to Europe. But in general, I think that's a fair assessment that just because of acceptance, more people are willing to take the step. But I think Nick in particular talked about how there's always, of course, a bit of a downtrade if you're trying to break into into professional esports, as in any sports as well, there's a certain risk attached to it. And I think that risk is higher in the West than it is in Korea. So I feel that also has to play a bit of a role there.
Nick, do you think it's a higher risk in the West?
Well, yeah, I think that the fastest way to kill any esports dream is to start thinking irrationally, is to start trying to say, okay, well, there's many reasons why I shouldn't do this. And many of those reasons in the West, you have entire families, friends, and culture saying, yeah, you shouldn't do it. That's a really bad idea. Shouldn't you do this instead? Shouldn't you do this instead? I think that when it comes down to trying to figure out, if there's a larger pool of talent, though, I think that if you view games as, if you really, really break it down and you view games as a system, right? And the people who perform best in the system have the level of discipline, intellect, a rigor, and patience to do really well in this system, especially to break it down. You start seeing that maybe the best and brightest in other cultures that were inherently responsible enough to not be playing games all day, and responsible enough to not say, I'm going to risk my future on being an esports pro. Those same people who would do really good at those skills aren't actually striving for this dream. However, I think in South Korea, you have those, and as I said, best of the best people that are naturally gifted in this way. I think for them, it's much more, it's a more viable path with more people in their life saying, yeah, that sounds plausible. Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Yeah, I think you could succeed in that. And because of that, you have some very intelligent people, some very disciplined people, and some very skilled players. And, this also could be the case in Sweden. Maybe Sweden is also this type of environment that actually nurtures these very high-performing individuals and say, yeah, maybe you can play video games.
Yeah, let me actually just answer that question right away. Sweden, for example, you can take a gap year at school where you can take a year from school, you can take a break, you can do whatever you want in that year. And if whatever you do, you can just go back. And that's something that even in most other parts of Europe, we don't even have. But for a lot of the pro players, that's actually perfect because they are taking that at an age where they are really getting good at video games. They're getting really interested, and then they can try that for a year. If it works out, then you can just follow their dream. And if not, then you gave it a shot for a year and you can fall back. Some of the pros that we currently have in HGC and Heroes of the Storm have taken exactly that way. We have Breeze, who plays for Fnatic, and at 16 years, he has taken that gap year and has said, okay, my parents agree that I'm just going to give this a shot. And a year later, he's one of the best players that we have in the scene and makes a ton of money out of that. So that worked out quite well for him. So the cost that you have if you give that a shot is very low in Sweden, just because if it doesn't work out, you can always go back and continue your education.
Mm-hmm. So
wow, that's fascinating. That's such a good point. Because
I wish I had that.
Breeze is someone who, if he wasn't playing Heroes, he'd be in college. He'd be in higher education. He'd be doing great things. That's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think on the flip side, Korea. Oh, my bad. I didn't.
No, go ahead,
but on the flip side, Korea, you can't really get diamonds without a lot of pressure, right? I think just in terms of populace, America has a lot more people than Korea, but Korea is still pumping out these talented players. And I think that comes down to pressure. And in Sweden, you can take that break year. But most of the time in Korea, if you're invested in esports a little bit, and if you fail, there's not much that you can do. There's a lot of pressure behind you. So you either quit early or you have that hunger that exceeds the standard of your peers, I think.
Mm-hmm. So are we moving closer to the idea in the West that esports is a viable career option? Khaldor, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, we definitely are. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt about it. It's a path that takes quite some time, but I mean, I've been in the scene for 16 years now, and back then there were maybe 2-3 players that were actually willing to make the jump and say, okay, I'm going to make a career out of it. And most of those are still around. But if you look at recent years, more and more are just willing to give this a chance. And for a lot of them, it's a viable option right now. It is, of course, also highly dependent on where you live and which game you're in. The prize pools and the salaries in, let's say, League of Legends, Overwatch are vastly bigger than in a lot of the smaller games. But even in the smaller games, depending on where you live, you can, if you're good enough and you play at the top of your game, you can make a living out of that. So all of a sudden, those social barriers are getting smaller. The prize money and the salaries are increasing. That makes it a lot more rewarding for you if you make the jump and you successfully make the jump. But yeah, in general, there's absolutely no doubt that it's becoming a more accepted path to take, not only in Europe, but also North America.
Nick, do you think we'll ever catch up to South Korea's esports infrastructure and programs?
So catch up in a way that will we have the same excellent players and championship teams? Yes, I think eventually. I think eventually, if given enough time, competition will eventually have a more bell curve / not this really hierarchy of the Korean teams playing all the time. However, do I think we're going to have the same type of infrastructure? No, and I think because the Korean infrastructure is very much steeped in their culture. I think until U.S. culture around gaming changes, then will we maybe start to see something that is similar. Now, what we do have that's going on, and it's actually growing quite fast in the West, is collegiate gaming. And I think collegiate gaming in the West is I think it's interesting because it tries to mirror traditional modes of U.S. success. It tries to make esports into something that you can convince your Western parents isn't a waste of time. So I think that you start to look at how U.S. esports is growing. Well, it's taking a very American path. It's taking a very U.S. path. I don't think it's going to take the same path of Korea, and I actually don't think it's possible. I don't think it's possible to convince a bunch of Americans to live like Korean youth, because they are not Korean youth, and their culture and history is just very, very different. So I think, again, to kind of paraphrase, equal, yes, one day, but it will be a different path.
Sure. So we have a chat comment from Eleanor, who says, doesn't it come down to organization again? While in the West there are organizations like ESL and provide a platform for players to compete, they don't give the structure like KESPA gives for becoming a pro player and the legitimacy. So, Josh, do you think we could benefit from a government organization like KESPA?
That's a difficult question to answer because
Khaldor's laughing.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm glad he got it.
Hard.
That's a very difficult question because KESPA has got a lot of pros and cons. Many people like KESPA. Many people also dislike KESPA within Korea. It goes down to politics as well. Once money gets involved within government, it's just very, very messy. Hopefully, if you get the right people, the smart people that really want to grow players, organizations, and audience in a wholesome way, then yeah, I think it'd be a very big benefit.
Yeah. Khaldor, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, like a couple of points. The question was phrased interestingly because on the one hand, you talk about a government body, which has, as already alluded to a bit, a lot of disadvantages as well. And then you have organizations where this is more like a league and a tournament structure, like the ESL. I think when it comes to esports in general, and also about can we ever catch up with Korea, there's several layers that we have to talk about. And there's a lot of, can organizations give players opportunities? And that, for me personally, comes down mostly to organizations that have teams, because I think they need to provide options. For example, provide team houses that players can live at and train, provide travel that will help you to at least boot camp if you're not going to live in a team house permanently, and just make sure that with your teammates you form a unit. But outside of that, it has to come from the player. So it's a mindset thing that has to change. For example, we've been talking about discipline a lot and how, especially in Korea, that existed for a long time. And things are like the status is changing, But for the longest time, that discipline didn't exist, especially in North America. Whereas in Europe, you had a lot of competition where there were rivalries going on. North America didn't have the same discipline, and players looked, of course, always with exceptions. Players looked at the games very differently and weren't willing to put the same amount of work into it. That whole scenario is changing right now, but it comes back down to the players at some point. We need organizations that help players or that enable players to make these choices and that give them options of what they could do. But at the same time, overregulation would be the wrong path to take, in my opinion. And I feel in the end, it comes down to the motivation that a player as a person has to become the best and what he's willing to do for that, he or she.
All right, it's time to take a quick break, but before we do, I want to ask our viewers to send us a message letting us know what topics you'd like to see us discuss on the show. We'll be right back.
We have 75 players in here. Let me hear you make some noise.
Hi, my name's Todd. We're going to be playing some H1Z1, and a lot of you out there are going to be able to win some prizes by guessing when our guests die. Sasha, are you ready to go play some H1Z1?
Let's do this.
I think we've seen this story before.
We got a lot of guests tonight from all over the world. They're competing for a trophy, our Champion of the Night prize. Which one of you is going to be the best player tonight?
Anybody that comes in my way is done.
Get a helmet, get a backpack, get a rifle.
Or just hide and hope I get lucky.
He's feeling the earth. That's a very Native American approach to battle.
I give the people what they want to see.
Oh my God! Oh wow, he took a big hit. He got it, guys!
Can you throw me in like the Norwegian server or like someplace where they're just not gonna find me?
No.
Did I die first?
No one's died that early in the game ever.
All right, welcome back, everybody. It's no secret to create a winning team, you need winning players, and esports organizations worldwide have been importing players from South Korea to ensure that they can vie for top spots across leagues. The industry has been saturated by these players, but it's hard to argue that they don't hold a certain advantage over non-Korean competitors. So how does a Korean esports org or team have a different structure or expectations than Western teams? Josh, why don't you start us off?
I think in terms of structure, there has been a lot of catching up that has been done. A lot of teams going back and forth to Korea and so on and so forth, learning from these Korean teams and organizations that help foster these teams and provide these boot camps. They learn from each other. But in terms of expectations, I think Korea has the upper hand in terms of, I guess, their cold-heartedness. I'm going to go a little bit dark here, but since you have so many hungry players that want to come up and be good, and you have these PC bongs and this community that is able to grow them mechanically, and by mechanics I mean good APM and all that stuff, you're able to switch them out very quickly. It's like if you underperform, you give you a little bit of time, still underperform, next player. And in that sense, I think in terms of expectations, Koreans are very, very high. And that is going to be a little bit difficult to catch up to.
Thomas, do you want to answer to this a little bit? How does a Korean esports org or team have different structure expectations than Western teams?
I think the performance part that he pointed out is really important. And I think performance in Korea, if you look at Korean teams, is the key aspect. But as for Western teams, it's not only about performance, it's also how marketable are you as a person or as a team. And it's not that important for the Korean teams usually. Like, as he said, it's like very performance driven. How good are you as a player? You're at the top, you belong in the team. If not, you're going to swapped out. Whereas if you look at how the sponsor structure is especially developed in North America and in Europe, a lot of the sponsors didn't go necessarily for the best players. They went for the players that were the most memorable, that had the biggest crowd behind them, and that were just from a marketable perspective way better. And it's actually one of the things that a lot of the Korean players never really understood. They look at that and they say like, how is it possible that that guy gets twice my salary or has like 2 sponsors, and I can beat him in a best of, like in any game, I can beat him 100 times and he doesn't win a single game against me. So that is one of the things where the Koreans also have a lot of catching up to do. And I think it's gotten better, but language barriers are always an issue when it comes to identifying with a player from Korea. There are some that are absolutely exceptional and they know how to play a crowd, but there are a lot of them who are insanely talented, very, very good, but they have bad English and they don't really know how to develop a personality that the audience just eats up and wants to see more of.
Sure. So go ahead, Nick. Yeah.
So I would love to talk about this, about currently the thing that I'm the most expert on, which is the Overwatch League. And I actually think the Overwatch League is this really interesting experiment that is this this crossing of a lot of these topics we've been talking about. For one, we have now reached the point where every single Overwatch team has a Korean player on it. It didn't start out that way, right? There were teams that didn't have Korean players on and it didn't work, or at least they felt the pressure to add Korean players. And the reason is because when it comes to Overwatch, mechanically they are the best. However, just what Khaldor was saying, a lot of the most hyped teams for the Overwatch League when it first started were teams that had just the most memorable players. These are teams that had streamers on it. These are teams that had players who were famous, but not really necessarily because they were the best at Overwatch. Sure, they were very skilled, Dallas Fuel, but these teams have imploded on themselves. But at the same time, we have new players like Dante, Sinatra, Agilities. These are young kids who, this is their very first job. The Overwatch League is the first job they've ever had. So we have this opportunity for the first time to have these North American players really introduced to the type of environment that I honestly think is the closest to South Korean esports that like North America has ever seen. These teams have coaches, they have entire team structures around them, and they definitely have a lot of pressure. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that while I think the balance between having a popular player and having a player who's really good has always been has not been equal. North America has always wanted the flashier player because we're trying to capture the imagination of fans that don't exist yet. I think that the Overwatch League, for the first time, maybe has both. We may have players that are not only very, very fascinating to watch, but are being bred into the skilled players that may actually have what it takes to be the very best.
So should teams be able to recruit any players they wish? Josh?
Why not? Why not? I mean, that's...
why not?
That's up to the coach, the organization, and what kind of team you want. If you want everyone to speak the same language, then do it. And if you don't really care about that, then don't care about it. I think there shouldn't really be any, because that creates prejudice, and why would you have prejudice when already amongst the players you'll know and they'll know who is better and who is valued for what sense.
All right, so let me pose it this way. How would you feel if the NALCS were all players who were born and raised in South Korea?
Is that for me?
Let's go. Go for it. Jump in.
LCS is the wrong example for me since I am not really invested in League, but just the same can be applied to other League, I suppose. I want to see the best play. So there's a lot of arguments that have been made in the past, in Heroes, in StarCraft, in any game that you have. Should there be restrictions of who can play where? And for certain tournaments, especially when we're talking about national tournaments, that makes, of course, a lot of sense. But outside of that, when we're talking about team play, I want to see the best play. And that might just be my view. I'm a little bit puristic on that. I want to see the best level of play, and I don't really care where you're from. Others have said that they want to cheer for local or for national champions, for people that they can identify with more. And I guess that can be a valid argument, but for me, that never really held too much water. So I'm agreeing wholeheartedly with Joshua here. I want to see the best players, And if that means that that's players from Korea, then that's just how it is. Then the rest of the world has to buckle up and get on that level. So the only thing that I can say to other regions is get good.
Nick, so I want to throw this question to you. With city-based teams then in leagues like the Overwatch League, does it change how people view the home team if it's made up of all imported players?
Okay, so first of all, I'm just so glad because I'm on the show a lot and you always hear me. This is the one gripe I always have. I say esports should be about the best players. I don't care about anything else. I'm so glad that I'm around some like-minded people this time. Yes, I think that I don't care where you're from. I don't care where you team from. It's all lame if you're bad. None of it matters if you're bad. If you're not the best, I don't want to watch you. And if you're not the best, no one else should want to watch you. I'm actually really glad you brought up that point because I was just going to bring up a Boston Uprising. So Boston Uprising is this. Oh, no, wait. This is Philadelphia Fusion. Yeah. I think this was Philadelphia Fusion. They had this hometown a hero type of deal in which they had an extra spot for their player. So like they thought, hey, wouldn't it be great if the player was actually from a Philly? So they had all of these tryouts in Philly, yada, yada. I think stuff like that is the wrong idea entirely. I get it. The team is based in Philadelphia, but no, they're not, right? I think you should have got the best player. You shouldn't have arbitrarily limited yourself to this group of players who may not even have the drive, may not even have the passion. They're only there because you put out this weird net that only exists in Philly. You know, like meanwhile, there's this player over in South Korea or there's this player over in Europe or who knows, and he would have been, and he or she would have been great on your team, but, you know, they can't do it because they didn't fit your PR scheme. So, yeah, I don't think teams personally should hire anyone if they're not the best at the game, because why are you here then? Why are you trying to compete in esports if you're not trying to win? If you're not trying to go for the championship, this is like the worst like money-making like venture in your life, you know? So yeah, I think that esports should be about the pro player, and that's it. Just if you're the best, then you should be on stage.
All right, go ahead,
Josh. I definitely agree. All these games are essentially languages that everybody in the world speaks. You watch soccer to watch soccer. You watch League because you like the game League. And how do you speak it? Beautiful play. Once a beautiful play comes out, something that's creative and like only a top tier team can do, you look to your friends, you're like, oh, did you just see what happened? We just spoke the same language just now. So I'd rather everyone speak the language of the game than it is more of like, you know, nationalities and rosters and roster lock, you know?
Oh, and on that magical note, we are coming to the end of our show. And I want to thank all of our viewers and our guests for being here. Tell us your final thoughts and where people can find you on social media. And we'll start with Khaldor.
Well, final thought is just once again that I think the Koreans might still be ahead of us, but that doesn't mean that the European and North American teams and players can't catch up. So there's some work to do, so get on it. And people can find me on Twitter at Khaldor.
Fantastic, thank you. All right, Josh, your final thoughts and where people can find you online.
My final thoughts are Korea. As a Korean, I'm very proud. We are very good, but it's not going to last forever. It's not infinite. I do feel that the best teams have the best teamwork, and that's regardless of language and where you're from. It's about, you know, the sense of family. You can find me on Twitter at DZMins, and that's about it for me.
All right, thanks, Josh. All right, Nick, your turn. Your final thoughts and where people can find you online.
Yeah, so I'm actually really lucky to work with a Korean company. I'm surrounded by Korean esports journalists and players all the time. So I have so much respect for the infrastructure that they put in. I think they really do set the bar really high, and I'm glad to see other regions try to strive to that. We're actually holding a huge esports conference, which we asked this very same question, and we're going to have Korean pros like Madlife, Shy. They're all going to be here in the States for sometimes the very first time. So you can find all about at InvenGlobal.com/IGEC. It's a really awesome esports conference we're putting on, and you can find me there at InvenGlobal.com, and on Twitter you can see below this. So yeah, thanks for having me on.
All right, thanks, Nick. And thank you to everyone who watched, commented, and shared the show. I'm Andy Roman. Don't forget to like our Facebook page and watch Game Talk Live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 2 p.m. Pacific time. We'll see you next time.